Do you think Aristotle's mom ever asked him, if all of your friends jumped off a bridge, would you do it too? Well, sadly, we don't know a lot about the relationship between Aristotle and Phaistos, but we'd like to think that they would have that conversation because it would remind us that even smart people are subject to this behavior called herding. Herding is doing things just because everyone around you is doing them too. Some examples of herding off the top of my head include lining up for hours to go to a Nickelback concert, wearing Crocs and socks, doing the wave at a sports stadium, or getting wasted on Goldschlager just because your friends do it. Not that I would ever do that. Stay clean, kids. Lining up for hours for a Nickelback concert. No wonder the idea of jumping on a bandwagon actually has a bad reputation. That prompts the question, where does the phrase jump on the bandwagon come from? In 1848, there was a clown politician, they frequently go hand in hand, called Dan Rice. And Dan would use his bandwagon and his music routine to go around and drum up support for his political campaign, and it worked. Other politicians wanted a piece of that action, and so they started to form bandwagons of their own. Bandwagons became common in political campaigns, and they started to mean then what they mean now, mindlessly following a herd or jumping on a bandwagon. Now, of course, mindlessly following a crowd can be a bit silly, but there are some positive aspects to herding. For example, choosing a video game platform or a social network will allow you to have more connections, access to better and more games, and so on. Email is as great as it is because everyone jumped on the computer internet bandwagon. Facebook, or for your younger people, Tumblr, is fantastic because all of your friends are on this social network. And of course, video game platforms that are popular are better because developers are going to build more games for those video game platforms. Speaking of video games, we're huge fans of Borderlands 2. Another example of great herding behavior is the modern jury system. Having a group of people choose someone's fate over an individual is a better system. And as Nassim Nicholas Taleb points out, it's been more profitable for us to bind together and move in the wrong direction than to move in the right direction alone. Now, is herding just a modern phenomenon that we only do now because of access to social networks and email and Nickelback concerts and Goldschlager? No, actually, herding's been around for a very, very long time. If you think humans have been around for about 150,000 years, we did herding for most of that time. We herded for most of that time because it was the only way to survive. I mean, if you think about it, it was the most physically harsh environment we had ever been in, and we needed to bind together in small groups and rely on each other for food, for shelter, for survival. What mattered was what other people were doing, and you needed to follow what those other people were doing if you wanted to survive. Back in those days, being alone or ostracized from the group would get you into worlds of trouble, so you did not want to be alone. You wanted to follow the herd. And that was most of our history. We're not the only ones who like to copy our friends. Other animals herd too. You've probably heard of schools of fish who bind together in balls or groups of fish in order to protect most of them from predators. If there was one fish and one predator, that fish is going to get eaten. But that same fish, if he's surrounded by some of his friends, has a much greater chance of survival. And so a big school becomes something bigger than just a bunch of fish. As our friend Aristotle, whose mother may or may not have asked him if he'd jump off a bridge if his friends did, once said, "The whole is greater than the sum of its parts." Have you ever seen the wave happen at a sports game? If you haven't, it looks crazy cool. And if you are at a sports game and you want to participate, the rules are very, very simple. Stand up and put your arms in the air when your neighbor does, and then sit down when your neighbor does. Easy. And when everybody does it, it looks crazy cool. That's what Aristotle was talking about. Now, for those of you who are obsessed with ants, you might be wondering, what about ants? Do ants herd? Well, it turns out that ants do herd, and sometimes they make mistakes when they herd, just like us. Turns out that if you trap ants in a little room with two perfectly good doors, and then spray some insecticide in that room, they're all going to freak out and move to just one of the doors. That's not good because it leaves some of the ants exposed to the poison for longer. But in a state of panic or agitation or whatever it is that ants feel, they stick together even though that behavior is suboptimal from their perspective. Back to humans for a second, it prompts me to ask, what are the craziest things that people have gotten all bandwagony about? Pet rocks, Beanie Baby, invisible pets, tie-dye, bell-bottoms, clogs, headbands, holiday sales, .com stocks, tulips, any new Apple product. What's the weirdest thing? Pet rocks. Speaking of holiday sales, sometimes Boxing Day sales lead to dangerous behaviors like riots. The worst riot in US history since the American Civil War happened in the city of Los Angeles in 1992. 55 people lost their lives, 2,000 were injured, and there was about $1 billion of property damage caused. A kind of information cascade happened during this riot when people did things they knew were wrong, but they did them anyway. Why do people riot? Why do we get involved in these herd behaviors that actually cause us to do things that we know are wrong? According to psychologist Ken Isehold, A riot usually happens with a single event. Police beating up on an innocent bystander or some other sort of event. The mob takes on a life of its own where individuals in the mob bring up deep-seated resentments. The mob can provide cover and anonymity to people and help them set aside their normal moral behavior. The mob becomes powerful and manic and offers people a temporary sense of belonging. It feels exciting and people feel alive. People don't feel like themselves when they're in a riot. It's like they take on a new identity, and they don't care as much about the consequences of their actions until the police show up. You might be thinking, oh, but we're so much smarter than that. We have access to the internet, we have Facebook, we have Apple products. Won't those help? But more information might actually make things worse. We have more access to information than we've ever had in history, and our brains can't handle it. This leads to something called information overload, which is our inability to deal with increasingly more information. We're like the locusts in the center of a swarm who can't see what the outer edge of that swarm is heading into, which is very, very bad. So sometimes it's important to not follow the herd, like when your friends are jumping off the Brooklyn Bridge, or when you're following a literal bandwagon, or during a riot, or a stock market bubble. Here's our quick and dirty advice on how to avoid the temptation of just following your friends mindlessly. Don't be afraid to look stupid. This is just generally a good thing to learn in life. There's nothing wrong with looking a bit dumb. Be willing to stand out when it matters. Embrace being different. Don't make important decisions when you're not focused on the choice at hand, and don't make decisions in a hot state, an emotional state. And don't forget, be very, very wary of bandwagons.